Good afternoon. The webinar will start in 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm John Torres, Vice President of Communication at NCBA CLUSA. Thank you for being here and joining us for Moving Beyond Paralysis, how your business can prosper during and after the COVID-19 crisis. This webinar is produced by the National Cooperative Business Association in partnership with our associate member, Stratus Wealth Advisors. So before we begin, I'll remind you of some of the housekeeping items. First, all participant phone lines will be muted during this presentation to reduce background noise. There will be a chance to pose a question, just not verbally. If you have a question, please type it into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Questions will be collected and answered toward the end of the program as time allows. NCBA CLUSA will be recording this program and it will be archived on our website. You'll receive an email containing a link to the posted recording as well as the presentation itself in the next few days. Now, with that said, I believe I covered everything. I'll turn it over to our Vice President of Cooperative Relations, Tamala Blaylock. Tamala.
Okay, well, good afternoon and good morning for all of our cooperative community audience that's joined us today. We are very excited to have our session today, Moving Beyond Paralysis, how their business can prosper during and after the COVID-19 crisis. Our CEO of NCBA CLUSA, Doug O'Brien, said something great today, that in terms of looking what we have done as an organization, we have transitioned from, reacting to pivoting to adapting, to this current economic and social and public health climate that we're in right now. And the same is also true for our members and in this space. And that's why this topic is so timely to have for all of our members for status that we're in, because not only can recessions and economic and stressors and public health matters happen, but so can regular life, which also is a disruption to our business and our operations and our norms. So with that, I would like to bring on our guest, Sam Brownell. And as he comes on, I will read an introduction. So Sam. Sam Brownell. Hi. So Sam has been a financial professional since 2006 and formed Stratus Capital Management in July 2013 to provide goals-based investment management and financial planning to individuals and small businesses. As the firm grew, an increasing number of independent business owners, including members of purchasing cooperatives, sought Sam's advice on maximizing the value of their business as part of their professional succession planning and their personal financial planning. In 2019, so just last year, the firm became Stratus Wealth Advisors, the umbrella for 3 business entities: Stratus Legacy Planning, Stratus Capital Management, and Stratus Valuation. Stratus Wealth Advisors focuses on proactive business continuity and succession planning for independent business owners, including business valuation, tax strategy and financial strategy consulting, as well as comprehensive financial planning and asset management. So thank you, Sam, for bringing this topic to our cooperative community office, particularly our purchasing cooperatives. So what was the impetus before having this session and why right now?
So good question, Tamla. And as everybody on the call knows, our life was totally different 4 months ago. And having gone through the last 3 months, we have fielded a ton of questions from business owners on everything from how has this pandemic affected the value of my business to what do I do if somebody gets sick? How do I open back up effectively? And so being able to present a presentation on business continuity planning not only allows people to take a deep breath and go, oh, okay, we're all in this together. We're not the only ones who are feeling this stressor, but also to help folks understand that we can get beyond that triage thinking and really start to figure out where do we go from now, as opposed to just sitting there and constantly running around in circles worrying, am I going to be in business? Am I going to be in business? Am I going to be in business?
Excellent. Well, so let's get right to it and have a great session. We look forward to everything you have to share with us today.
Great. So welcome everybody. It's great to have everybody here this afternoon. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule. We know everybody is working hard these days. And before we jump into today's topic, I really wanted to say how proud we are at Stratus to be an associate member of NCBA, because their mission of inclusivity is going to be really, really important as we think about better ways to rebuild the economy and rebuild our society. So thank you again to John and Tamla for having me here, and I look forward to the next 50 minutes or so of discussion. As Tamla said, my name is Sam Brownell, and I run Stratus Wealth Advisors, and our topic today is going to be business continuity planning. So John, next slide, please. So I thought we'd get started by thinking a little bit about business continuity planning. And if there's one thing you take from today's webinar, it's that business continuity planning has to be a priority of your organization, and it has to be a living document. It can't be something that collects dust on the shelf. And I know that lots of us have put together potentially some type of documents. I know that we have at Stratus, and when something like COVID happens, you realize, oh my gosh, we have a business continuity plan. It's sitting right over there on the shelf. Boy, we probably haven't updated that since the regulators told us to do that when the firm was first founded. So again, big takeaway from today, business continuity planning, it has to be a priority within your organization, and it has to be a living document. You have to update this as times change. Next slide, please, John. So before we started today, John and Tamla and I were sharing some COVID stories of what it's been like to be at home. And you're probably wondering in a presentation on business continuity planning why there is a cupcake on a high chair. And like many of you, we've not only been working from home, my wife and I, but also doing childcare. And what you see here is one of my 2.5-year-old son's most valued assets. And this comes everywhere with him, including when we go out on walks around the neighborhood and around the region. And we're very lucky here in the DC region. We live very close to Rock Creek Park. And so we take many walks there. And the story I'm about to tell you will set the stage for why business continuity planning as a living document is so important. So next slide, please. So out where we are, Rock Creek Park has Rock Creek, which has some very steep banks, probably 6 to 7 feet on either side. And my son and I were out there a month or so ago, and like any good kid, he's running along, not paying attention to where he's going, and catches his foot on a tree root, and bam, hits the deck, and it's a total yard sale. Everything's all over the place, and out of the catch the cupcake as it slowly rolls over the bank down into the creek. And of course, as you can imagine, it's complete pandemonium, shrieking, crying. My goodness, I didn't plan for this. We were just going for a walk along the creek. And so after about 30 seconds, I realized I'm not going to be able to convince this kid that this is one of a billion plastic cupcakes in the world. I'm going to have to do something about this. So next slide, please, John. So a little bit down the bank from where the cupcake went in, I noticed that there are these fallen down trees that are lying across the creek. And so I get my son and I say, look, you cannot follow me. And I'm going to go out on this branch. So I head out on the branch to try to capture this cupcake as it floats downstream. While I'm about halfway out there, I hear this, oh my goodness, are you okay? Are you lost? And I turn around and see that this older woman who's walking her dog has come along and seen a child with no parent who's in tears and thinks, oh my goodness, this kid is lost. What do? I can't get too close to him because I'm worried about contracting coronavirus or giving it to him. And as I'm watching this prone in the middle of the river, I'm thinking to myself, boy, this really did not go as planned. And moral of the story is I was able to secure the cupcake, get back to the bank, reassure this woman that this was not a lost child, I was the father, and thank her for comforting him from an appropriate distance. But what it brings home is the importance not just of having a plan, but also updating that plan as we encounter new obstacles. And for me, the big takeaway here was either the cupcake can't come with us, or I've got to bring a toy of equal or greater value in case something were to happen to it. So as we get into the meat of what we're going to talk about today, just keep in mind that having a plan is better than no plan, because having a plan means that you have something that you can go to do when everybody's stress level is high. Updating that plan based on changing conditions becomes even more important, and especially when we're in the midst of so much uncertainty with this COVID pandemic. So next slide, please, John. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to walk you through two case studies drawn from real life work that we've done at Stratus. But first, just wanted to go over what do we think of as business continuity planning at Stratus. And there are four keys here. And one is, as I said before, and you'll hear me say it again, it's a living document. You're creating a living document so your company is prepared no matter what happens, and it's got to be updated. It's got to be reviewed. And these can be great chances for you and your employees to communicate. One of the things that really gets lost, and we'll see it in both examples today, is communication over time. Trigger points. There are always trigger points when we talk about continuity planning. Something is going to cause you from going from operations as normal to operations abnormal. And we've outlined three of them in what we call the 3 Ds: death, disability, and divorce. A lot of business owners we work on, they've spent a lot of time thinking about the first D, death. A lot less time on the other two. But we find that in our work, divorce and disability are at least as likely to happen, if not more so, than death. And particularly think about a time like now, because that D of disability, that can be really important in a health crisis. If a leader, a key employee, a business owner ends up on a ventilator, what are you going to do? Next slide, please, John. So then we get to the more proactive part. How do we use business continuity planning to get us out of that bunker mentality? And one of them is thinking bigger, thinking entrepreneurially, thinking forward, and not just thinking about what can go wrong. Yes, it's important to be prepared if there's a cyber attack and your computer system goes down. If you happen to own a warehouse and it gets flooded, yes, those are really important things to think about. But if all we do is think about the negative, we miss a lot of opportunities for the positive, and we also miss a lot of opportunities for great conversations amongst the staff. And as we'll get to a little bit later, but it's something that another associate member of NCBA, Gary Pittsford, likes to say, and it's even more true in a crisis. You have to spend time working on your business, not just in your business, because we can get so caught up in the day-to-day that we're not looking at the bigger picture and seeing the opportunities that come from a crisis. And one of those is, what are you going to do? What systems, what processes are you going to put in place so that people can get access to critical information and they can make critical, timely decisions? For example, let's say that the business owner ends up in the hospital on a ventilator with the coronavirus. Who can make payroll? Let's say you've got to contact the bank to get a line of credit. Who's authorized to speak to the banker? These become really, really big issues when 3-4 months ago, they might not have seemed like big issues. Next slide, please, John. So the first case study we're going to get in today is really all about the ownership mindset, communication, and the fact that when stressful events come up, it can be very easy for owners to change their mind. So next slide, please. So we find that lots of times, it's not that business owners don't have a continuity plan. It's that that plan is here. It's in their head. It's formalized. It's never been written down, and it's never been communicated. And so if the owner is the trigger event or part of the trigger event, then everybody else really is just running around wondering what to do. Next slide, please. So the first business we want to walk you through today was an independent HVAC dealer. Had been a successful business around for a long time. And one of the critical things to keep in mind as we go through this is that third bullet point, revenue. Revenue had peaked in 2013 and had then started to slide. And just by sheer coincidence, the owner had decided to get a business valuation in 2013 because he had thought maybe he might put the business up for sale. And you'll see how important that becomes to the story as we get more into it. So next slide, please, John. So the trigger event, as we talked about, all of these business continuity plans are based around trigger events. So the owner decided in 2018, after some not insignificant health issues, that he didn't have motivation. He didn't want to continue to have the risk of running the business and taking care of his health. And where this really caused problems was the owner wanted the business to outlive him. And those two things don't mesh very well because there had been no discussion about how ownership was transferred. How does the business continue from, in this case, the founder to that next generation of ownership? And it's particularly important for those of us in businesses where a lot of the business is built around the reputation of the owner, not transferring those relationships to your other employees, to your key team members, can cause lots of problems. Next slide, please. So what was the result of this? So the result was that the owner wanted out. He wanted an updated valuation business. He came, got an updated valuation, and boy, was he upset. My business is worth less than 50% of what it was worth 5 years ago. What is going on here? You have a very angry owner. And this is something for all of us to keep in mind, especially as we go through this coronavirus crisis and we're asking ourselves, what has happened to the value of my business? Keep in mind, when we're looking at the value of a business, when a professional who does business valuation looks at the value of a business, they are looking at how you can take your assets and productively turn them into cash flow. Again, that's taking your assets, productively turning it into cash flow. The length of time in business, it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the value of the business, especially once you get beyond that first 3 to 5 year period when lots of businesses fail. So there right now, and you're thinking, geez, what has happened to the value of my business? Keep in mind that as long as you have some processes in place, as long as you have a trajectory of being able to successfully turn assets into net cash flow, and these can be continued into the future, you don't have a whole lot to worry about, because every industry, every business goes through rough patches. And it's the processes, the planning that we have in place that makes the business worth more. So just something to keep in mind, because one of the things that's sad about this situation is that the owner continues to sit there right now, and the business is still owned by him. He is in a very difficult position because he doesn't want to put in the time and energy to grow the business, but he also doesn't want to accept a bargain basement price. And that's really the definition of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the reason that continuity planning is so important. So next slide, please, John. So let's walk through some lessons learned here. And the first one we talked about on the last slide, which is length of time in business does not necessarily mean that that asset is more valuable. The second one is really important, especially to this period of intense stress and uncertainty that we live in, where many business owners are still worried about the survival of their business. And in our experience, when you go through these periods, there are definitely going to be business owners over the next 2 to 3 years who say, I've had enough. I don't want the risk anymore. I don't have the motivation. It's all been drained out, and I want to sell the business. And if there's not a plan in place to transition ownership, to make sure that those key employees don't walk out the door, it's going to be really, really difficult for that owner to be able to get the value out of the business that they might otherwise have gotten. So again, we're not just planning for what could go wrong from a day-to-day basis, or even something like a computer hack. Growth. We look at this as a growth opportunity. Transitioning ownership does not have to be a disaster. It can be a way for your business to grow. Lots of times, what it took to take the business from the founder to now is much different skill set than what it'll take to grow a business that's already running a multi-million-dollar operation and grow it to tens of millions of dollars. So next slide, please. So what could have been done? Let's look at this scenario and think what could have been done differently. Or encouraging all business owners to contact us, and we're doing with all of our clients, is cash flow analysis. Cash is king right now. Sit down and figure out between what you're making, what you're paying, and what you have in the bank, how long that's going to last. And we're going to get into a little bit more detailed example later of this. But the key with this cash flow analysis is A, be honest. Let's not pretend like business is going to come back faster. Let's not pretend like we're going to be able to keep our payroll low, even if our business is operating at 25, 30, 40% of what it normally would. So let's be honest with these projections so that we can spot danger down the road before we have $0 in the bank account. That's not where we want to end up. Another thing to consider, and difficult business owners to think about spending money right now, but getting an objective third party to take a look at your business, even if it's a high level view, can help point out areas that you might have overlooked. I know with our business, it's very easy as the owner to be so emotionally attached that you're either missing problems or you're overlooking them because you don't want to see what's behind that curtain. Well, that objective party doesn't have that same emotional attachment and can be a very big help to you as you look to strategize to grow out of this crisis. Next slide, please. So the next one we're going to talk about focuses a lot on communication, and we're going to look at family business, and this is really important. I was actually earlier today on a call with a colleague of mine, Matt Allen, who is a professor at Babson and runs a wonderful program there for family businesses. And one of the things that he talked about was how you can divide the generation that's running the business from the generation that will inherit the business, ask them the same question, and come up with completely different answers. Because lots of times what we have in our head as being communicated hasn't actually been communicated. And so while the older generation may think they have a great plan and everybody knows about it, the inheriting generation may go, what? What plan? So next slide, please. So this particular case study is going to focus on the divorce deed. And this is one that's often overlooked. And when we read through operating agreements or buy-sell agreements, lots of times death is handled, divorce almost never, disability sometimes. And so the tricky thing with a family business is that you not only have to work with these people, you also have to live with them. And so getting that line of communication set up and also getting the documents put together up front, yes, it can be a little stressful. Yes, you can butt some heads, but it can help alleviate problems down the line. Next slide, please. So this is an independent grocer, and it was owned by the parents, husband and wife. They had 3 daughters, but one of the daughters worked in the business and was in line to inherit. The other daughters were doing other things outside of the business. Now the daughter got married, and this is going to become a big part of this, because not only did the daughter get married, but the husband then started to become an employee of the organization and was in a leadership role. So next slide, please. As you can imagine, the trigger event here was divorce. The marriage didn't work out and they got divorced. And so at this point, the succession plan was underway, and part of the business had already been gifted to the daughter over a 4-year period. And this was the time that the parents were going to sell the rest of the business and retire themselves. Problem is, the divorce threw a huge monkey wrench into everything, because the documents themselves did not go over what happened in the event of divorce, and more importantly, didn't lock out the husband from suing in the divorce for ownership of the company. Next slide, please. So the sad result here is that the husband ended up with a minority ownership stake, because the future of the company was decided not by the internal owners, but by a judge. And that's really, really difficult place to end up. And I think at this point, all of us should be asking the question, if I were an employee of this organization, would I want to come to work? Would I be motivated to continue? Who's leading this company? So raising more questions is not a great way to go through a transition of any kind, but especially an ownership transition. Next slide, please. So big lesson learned here is you need to consider other avenues besides death for potential transfer of ownership in the business. And one of those is divorce. We talked about disability earlier. The first case study was about a change of mind. All of these things need to be addressed, need to be talked about and communicated. And that's the important thing. And in our work, our experience, lots of times a family ownership transfer takes more time because the communication is so critical. You don't want to sit down at the table and start talking about an ownership transfer, and it turns out that the owner's cousin, who's been in the business for 15 years, has just hated the way that that the business was run and not said anything about it, because at that point it's just going to blow up, and we're not going to be talking about ownership transfer. We're going to be talking about the relationships in the family. So think about that. Even if you're not in a family-owned business, think about how important communication is so that your employees know what's going on in your organization and who's going to take on which roles. Next slide, please. So in this case, what could have been done? And we've talked about some of these things already. Legal documents, they need to be reviewed. They need to be reviewed both on the professional and the personal side, and especially when a trigger event happens, and not even a trigger event, but also a material event. And in this case, a material event was the marriage of the daughter and the husband beginning to work in the business. That should have clicked on a light and said, we need to update some planning, because we are in a much different situation, much different scenario than we were pre-marriage. Again, open, honest discussion. Yes, it's hard to start these discussions, but having an open, honest discussion, getting things out on the table and doing it on an ongoing fashion so that you can update people as facts on the ground change is really, really helpful. As we said up front, spend time working on your business, not just in your business. And this is where an outside party can help, especially if you come to certain loggerheads in the business, is getting everybody to think proactively, think entrepreneurially, think forward, and we can help maneuver around some of those issues that have just been gnawing at everybody. And lots of times then we can come back and open up that discussion, and it can be much more productive because we've already shown that we can have a productive business discussion without getting into a fight. So next slide, please. So at this point, a lot of you are probably asking, well, geez, I don't want to end up like that. That sounds terrible. What do I do? So this is where what we call creating a roadmap. And we're working with business owners on 3 steps. And you can see them here. And we'll go through each one of them. And there are templates for each one. First one is saving the patient, the business triage. So John, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the cash flow analysis template that we spoke about earlier. And we have this template and are happy to share it with folks if it would be of interest. But this is a basic template that we've set up here. On the top, revenue. You're projecting your revenue. And remember, let's be honest, if your business has been affected negatively by COVID, let's not assume that it's going to bounce back just because the states are starting to reopen. On the flip side, we do work with certain businesses, certain industries like independent hardware stores, independent grocers, who have done very well. For those folks, let's not assume that you're going to continue to do well. Maybe people have pulled in purchases that they were going to make later in the year because they've been stuck at home. Maybe we get hit with a second wave and demand really dries up and people aren't willing to do as much discretionary spending because they need to spend on the essentials. So if you're in that position, maybe you say, all right, maybe we're doing 85, 90% of what we were doing March, April, May. Be conservative, it will be helpful. Then on the expense side, remember, cash outlays only. We don't care here about depreciation or any other non-cash expenses. We just care about what's going out of your bank account. And a big one to focus on here is payroll. Many of us were helped by the Payroll Protection Program loan. As stuff starts to come back online, don't assume that you're not going to have to pay folks just because your revenue isn't as high. So keep a real close eye on that payroll line. Then we look at the bottom here where we're projecting a net income or loss. And then let's take that cash balance. What do we have in the bank account and how long is that going to last? And in this example, we see that, in October, we're running out of money. What this does is it allows us as a business to spot problems before they occur so that we can come up with the appropriate mitigation strategy. We don't want to wait until there's no money in the bank and then go, what do we do? Let's get in front of this. Let's be proactive about this. Next slide, please. Once we've saved the patient, once we make sure that there's enough cash flow to keep our business moving, then we want to start thinking proactively. And this can be a great exercise, and we're doing this with folks. This can be a great exercise to run internally with all of your staff. We call it the activities and services template. Have each person independently list the activities and services you provide and then rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 in 3 categories. Is this teachable? Can I teach this to a new employee? Does this provide a differentiator from our competitors? And for a lot of you, I don't want you to think of, do we offer a completely unique product or service, but it's how we offer that. Let's look at that bottom line. This is an independent hardware store. They provide a service in barbecue equipment. Now, every hardware store that I've ever been in provides barbecue equipment. These folks specialize in the on-site repair of barbecue equipment. Now, that's a differentiator. Not every hardware store does that. So think about that when you're thinking about differentiation. Finally is loyalty creating. Does this activity or service create repeat business? Does it drive that customer to come back to my store again, or are they just viewing me like a commodity? Add them all up there in the right-hand column, and you'll get a good view of the way that you think about the activities and services of the business. Then you can sit down and discuss as a team, what are those core activities and services? And which ones do we really think are core to our operations? Because one of the great things about a time of crisis is it makes us look much more critically at the products and services and activities that we are offering to our customers. When times are good, it's very easy to say, oh, you know, we should probably do something about that business unit, or that product line never really sells, but business is good. We'll handle that later. Now can be a great opportunity to prune that dead wood. You can save money now, and you can refocus your monetary and your human resources on what you really, really do well. That's a key to moving forward proactively with growth and not getting stuck in a mindset of paralysis. Next slide, please. Finally, and we spoke about this earlier, an operational assessment by an objective third party. Having somebody take your finances, how the two of them speak to each other, is key to your long-term health. It can help identify those red flags. Not just, we need a new computer system, or we need to make sure we lock our doors at night, but we're not focusing on our core customers. And I'll give you a quick story here. We worked with, a few years ago, a paint store owner who wanted a value of the business because he wanted to do some succession planning. He swore up and down to us that he was selling to high-end clients. We went in, we talked to the staff, we did the valuation, we looked at what the products that they were selling. Turns out that this store, this owner, were selling primarily to a do-it-yourself market. Now that misalignment alone was creating a huge gap that could not only have added value to the business, but also added revenue and growth to the business. So we need to think about these things as we are deciding how we want to move forward. And lots of times getting somebody on the outside who doesn't have the emotional attachment, who is looking at the business as a whole, can be very, very helpful. Next slide, please. So just an overview, 3 things to do right now. Ongoing cash flow analysis, set it up. And our suggestion is to run it at least once a month. Things are changing very quickly on the ground right now. So you don't want to wait 4, 5, 6 months before you update this. because it could be too late. Normal time, sure. Once, twice a year, that's fine. Now, let's update it once a month as things change, because we could get better. We could then go backwards. We could slowly get better. We don't know. Take the time to update this. Then proactive, be proactive. Think about those core activities and services, how you're going to focus on those core activities and services, and what you might be able to prune to save yourself money. And finally, and when we get to the next slide, there's a link. We have an initial operational assessment tool on our website. It takes 10 to 15 minutes. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please, John. So resources, what resources are available to business owners right now? We are happy to provide you with both the cash flow analysis template and the activities and services template. You can format it however works best for your organization. As we mentioned at the end of the last slide, free 10 to 15 minute initial operational assessment. You can use this link. You'll be getting the slides in the next couple of days. 18 questions about your operations, gives you a real high level look at what's going on versus your industry. And then you can decide whether you want to go do a more in-depth analysis or whether you're going to take this and talk with your team about some potential strategies for moving forward. We are here to help anyone in the community. We have been offering 30-minute complimentary consultations since the beginning of March. We will continue to do that until we are back on a solid footing. If that takes through the rest of this year and into next year, not a problem. Helping each other is what's going to get us through this. And please use our website. There are lots of resources, lots of tips there. Next slide, please, John. So before I close and we open it up for questions, just remember, business continuity planning, it's got to be a priority in your organization, and it has to be a living document and updated on an ongoing. Otherwise, it becomes outdated and it's not very useful. My contact information is here. I'm going to answer as many questions as I can now. If we don't get to your question, I know that John and Tamil will provide me with a list of questions, and I'll be able to reach out to people individually. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and we'll turn it back over to Tamil for questions.
Okay, Sam, thank you for that session, and I really appreciate that you did it through storytelling. So it's very relatable to have instances of things that have really happened and how planning for all of these the 3 days, as you put it, or not planning for these 3 days ahead of time had an impact on how things have moved forward. That is rough to have your life decided by a judge. So starting with a few questions that we received. The first one is, particularly now that we are in a time of COVID-19, so this isn't a normal recession as we're used to experiencing one. There's a pandemic married to it. How has this time, particularly with COVID-19, changed business continuity planning?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I think that it's done two things. Number one is good for those of us in the business continuity planning world is it's brought it to the forefront of a lot of people's minds, because what might have seemed at the end of December, beginning of January, like a far off crisis on the other side of the world quickly became not only a health but an economic crisis in this country. And so I think it's helped all of us, myself included, realize just how important this planning is. And another thing that we have seen a lot is it sparked a lot of really good questions and discussion amongst business owners about what are those key elements that I need to be focusing on, not just within my business, but also within my community, to help beyond just my business. And we've seen a lot of the businesses that we work with that have done better through this, the folks in the hardware, the grocery industries, they've really, whether it's buying lunch from local restaurants, whether it's providing groceries to first responders, this I think is going to become a bigger part of their planning going forward. And it's also refocused us on just how important the local economy is, because we may not be able to rely on our supply chain from across the world all the time. And if we're relying on our neighbors, and as NCBA is always talking about, if we're thinking inclusively in our communities, that really makes a big difference. So from a business continuity planning standpoint, being able to think locally has been a huge change, as opposed to just, well, what happens if I can't get this piece from Europe or Asia?
Okay. Another question coming in, looking at community and how we engage with it. Our members, they have so many different communication channels: Twitter, email, website, it goes on. So among those, what should be the highest priority in terms of maintaining communication?
Yes, and I guess I'd ask, is this in terms of communication with employees, customers, both?
I imagine it's employees and customers, but probably customers are probably the top focus, given how this question was written.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question, because it has changed the way a lot of businesses, even businesses that are able to operate almost full steam like grocery stores, have seen the online and the delivery side of the business pick up quite a bit. So what we're talking with clients about is making sure that you meet clients across multiple different channels, because everybody's at a different point. Some people, and I was just talking to a client out in Colorado the other day, she started doing grocery delivery and is never going back. She's never going back to the grocery store. So I think it's important that businesses look at all of the channels. And then what we're encouraging folks to do is talk to your customers, engage with them with some type of survey, whether it's online, whether it's through a social media platform, or even in the store. Chat with these folks and figure out how they're buying, where are they purchasing from, and how likely they are to use different methods, because it may be that your business is going to be forced to pivot to a certain model where the delivery option, let's say, is much more important to your operations than it was even 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah, that is definitely for sure. Another question that we have is that, especially considering the culture of cooperatives in their ownership model, for owners who are considering exiting, how much should they include the employees in the business continuity planning?
Yeah, now that's a great question, and there are a number of different strategies for transferring ownership. And in the past, lots of times what we saw was just either an individual to individual or group to group type of transfer, where, let's say, I had owned the business and Tamara wanted to buy it from me, and we set up a plan to transfer my 100% share to then be her 100% share. What we're seeing, and there are lots of examples of this, and there's a great firm, I know that some of them are listening in today, Project Equity out on the West Coast, that does a lot of work with this, which is the transition of ownership from one or two or a couple partners to that worker-owned model. And that can be a really, really useful way to do it, especially, and we've seen in instances where the owner themselves is very committed to the employees and to keeping the business in the community. That can be a big one. And we've had conversations with a couple business owners about that, where they want the business to stay for the community. They don't want a big national chain to come in and buy them out and run it based off of what's best at the overhead corporate P&L level. They want it to be the community's store, the community's place to gather and talk. And that can be a great opportunity to introduce the worker model. And it also, when we start thinking about transitions, whether it becomes a worker owned or an employee stock ownership plan, those are great ways to get the employees themselves to not only buy into the business, but to be more motivated. As you all know so well, if I'm working in a business that I also have an ownership stake in, boy, that gives me a lot more agency to want to push the business forward, as opposed to just collecting my paycheck and going home at the end of the day.
Right. You suddenly become much more curious about financials week to
Yes,
week and
yeah,
month to month. Imagine how that inspires that kind of curiosity. Going along the same thing about transitioning ownership, 2020, is a milestone year, and I imagine there are quite a few owners who were planning to retire or transition in this year, before the realities of this spring and early summer have happened. Should they continue on with those plans if they really had a plan that was well researched and going to activate in 2020, or should they, just given everything that's happening, should they wait?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a couple things that we would encourage folks to think about, and questions that they can bring up in their own mind. How long have you been planning this? If this is something that is in the early stages, 1, maybe up to 2 years, then maybe you can think about pushing it. If you've been planning this for a while and you have a good solid plan in place, and you know who that next leader is going to be, and you've been helping to groom them, then you can keep going. The second question to ask yourself is, as the owner, as the leader, how much more stamina do you have? How much more risk do you want to take? Because crises like this, they're stressful. There isn't a business owner, co-op leader out there who hasn't spent long days pondering, what happens? Where do I go from here? How do I make sure that we don't cease to exist? And so a lot of it can do with, and it goes back to the case study we talked about today, is thinking more critically about, where am I, and is my mind really in this to be able to work for the next year or two to pull ourselves back up? Or is that better left to the next generation of owners, whether it's a single owner, a partnership, or it ends up being some type of employee-owned model?
Taking that from a employee-owned model, how does this advice change or transition or become a bit more nuanced when we are talking about member or worker-owned cooperatives?
Yeah, no, that's good, because it is a little bit different, because we're not necessarily talking about a complete ownership transfer, and we're talking a lot about leadership changes. And the big things that any good ownership transfer, any good plan, remember, the bottom line is, think about the words, right? It's business continuity plan. We want to make sure that we're able to continue this organization, this operation, with the least hiccups possible. And so what it really starts with, and we encourage anybody who calls us, regardless of whether we can help them directly or we're going to say, hey, look, we've got great partners, we're going to refer you to somebody, is think about, who is that next leader or leaders? Who is the right person to run this organization? Because all organizations change over time. Mm-hmm. And what worked for the last decade may not work for the coming decade. And so we would say, start there and look at which internal people or potentially external people may be the best leaders coming up for the next decade. And then you have to start engaging with those people, because a leadership transition, as we've all seen, it's never seamless, but it works better if you give yourself some time. If you're looking at a 6-month transition, boy, we would say, don't do that. Give yourself some more time.
Okay. So just looking at time, we have definitely one more question. We might be able to fit in one more after this, depending how it goes. along the lines of selling to employees, how could you plan for death, disability, and divorce, and what's the best way to use the use of buy-sell agreements and insurance? So I believe if you're planning on selling to your employees, so transitioning to like a worker co-op, how do you plan for death, disability, and divorce? You dealt with that a bit, but I probably want you to go a little bit deeper to it. And then also how that relates to buy-sell agreements and insurance.
Yeah, excellent question. And so those of us who aren't lawyers tend to glaze over when the legal stuff comes up, and I get it. It's difficult, but having those documents in place is really important. And so a buy-sell agreement and all the different variations of it really sets forth the rules. How is this business going to be valued? How will the purchase happen? Is it going to happen through an ESOP, right? The employee stock ownership route? Is it going to happen through some type of third-party bank financing? Is it going to happen through ourselves? Says, look, I'll take a 10% upfront cash, and then we'll pay out the other 90% over the next 5 years. And so that buy-sell agreement is really your roadmap for laying out the plans. And then within that, you get into the very specifics of the 3 Ds, death, disability, divorce. And that's where things like those key man insurance policies become really important, because if I was bringing Tamela on as a partner and she now had bought in 25% and I had a heart attack and died, not only having insurance on me helps, but it needs to be stated that that insurance can then be used for the specific purpose of purchasing the business. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's important to include in these buy-sell agreements, and also just any of these legal documents, is it's got to give the purchasing party, whether it's a single person, a partnership, or the employees, the ability to go and take out a loan when a trigger event happens. Lots of documents we reviewed do not have anything in there about the workers or the key employees' ability to go and borrow money. The operating agreement may say something like, the first right of refusal belongs to the current employees. But if it doesn't go on and say how those current employees are supposed to actually purchase the company, then everybody's scrambling around and the lawyers get involved and it becomes expensive. So it's really defining, how is the transition going to happen? And then if these contingencies happen, what will we do? And so just to touch on the last two quickly, disability, a big one that we encourage everybody to do is, what constitutes disability? Is it 6 months of not showing up to the office? Is it you're on bed rest and you can't, you're in a coma? I mean, what does that mean to the organization, disability? Clearly defining that means that you don't end up having to get into a legal argument about it. And then finally, the divorce is, and we touched on a little bit earlier, but it's really important, especially when you're talking family businesses, but even when you're not, to make sure that it is very clear that the line of ownership, and the line of ownership is going to go through the company and not through the divorce proceedings, because you can end up with a situation like we saw where somebody is deciding what happens to the future of the company who's not part of the company. And what you want to do is say, look, even if the husband and wife own 50-50, let's say, which is the way some businesses are set up, whoever stays has the ability to purchase the rest of the business away. That needs to be written down so that there's no confusion about whether the husband or wife, whoever is a party that leaves the business, is able to continue to collect income, even though they may not be part of the business anymore.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And looking for closing thoughts for today's webinar. definitely given us a lot to think about. It made it very accessible, what we, why we need business continuity planning. 3 areas specifically to focus on the impact of what happens when any of those events trigger a transition. And also looking at, what you presented during your presentation was about how the need to work on our business. So even particularly in their times, there's a lot of change and transition and disruption that's not planned. To work on our business, there is an opportunity to perhaps seize another opportunity or thrive with just the adjustments in supply chain. So what is the benefit of perhaps seeking an outside eye, to have that analysis done of your company, particularly now?
Sure, and it's a great that was a great summary, and it is very important to be able to pull back and look critically at your business, and especially in a time of crisis like this. The business owners that we talk to, that can be one of the hardest things to do, because you're running around trying to put out fires left and right, and that's where having somebody who is external, who has experience with your industry, who has experience with the way that the planning process goes, can really help you as the owner or owners of the business to ask those bigger questions about where are we going and how do we get there. And having that objective, non-emotional voice is very, very helpful. And we would encourage everybody to seek it out from a trusted advisor, because lots of times, and I know my poor wife goes through this too, lots of times she's the sounding board, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And so engaging a professional can be very, very helpful in these times, because they can really help to refocus you from putting out the daily fires to coming up with that cohesive vision and forward planning, so that you can get your business going again and not feel like you're constantly just stuck in the spin cycle.
Well, that is a great thought to leave it on. So we're focusing on the future and vision, and focusing and moving forward and thriving with the opportunity, that this economic and public health time has provided us with. So Sam, we want to thank you so much, for your time and for making a lot of these, like you said, legal topics accessible for those of us who kind of gloss it over and it happens. For sure. We want to thank all of our members who have watch this live, and those of us who will watch it, the replay. We want to keep the conversation going. You're welcome to email us, tweet at us, Facebook at us. If you have any questions, and we get enough response and demand, we can do a part 2 of this, and we would look forward to doing that as well. So thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience, and everyone have a wonderful Thursday.
Take care, everybody.